We were all excited. Our seminary had just hired the foremost authority on the ethics and theology of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Korean man, Dr. Hak Jun Lee. And we were excited, but we were also a little curious about how a son of Korea had come to have such love and affection for a son of our community. Dr. Lee hit that campus and he did not disappoint. But on the first day of class, I got my face cracked, but I also got my life fixed. He was going over the syllabus, discussing our reading assignments, integration papers, presentations, final analysis, comprehensive analysis. And I noticed what I perceived to be a gaping omission in the course content. And so I raised my hand and I said, "Excuse me, Dr. Lee, are we also going to discuss the improprieties of Dr. King? I mean, after all, this is an ethics class and his improprieties are part of public record." And Dr. Lee, for his part, was super gracious and he said something like, there are a lot of layers to Dr. King and we're going to be digging into, to as many as we can. And so I thought it was an interesting answer, but it was not the one that I was looking for. I mean, I was expecting a rousing, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, we're going to get into all of that. I mean, I had been a part of these dominant culture institutions for many years. And, whenever we discussed anything about Dr. King, somehow his improprieties had always found a way into the conversation. And so Dr. Lee, in my immediate sort of assessment, was in violation of what had been the standard. And then he did a lecture that would set the tone for how we would evaluate the content for the entire quarter. The lecture was called The Art of Traditioning. And Dr. Lee said, in order for a tradition to take hold, there are 5 things that must be in place. A formative narrative, a way to celebrate that narrative, a celebration of that narrative, governing laws and values, a way to disseminate the information concerning the governing laws and values of that people, and a way to practice said governing laws and values of the people. And he says, so for example, let's take our Jewish brothers and sisters. What is their formative narrative? Whole class yells out, Exodus story. It's like, good. He says, what is the celebration of that formative narrative? The Passover. And he says, what are the governing laws and values of our Jewish brothers and sisters? And we yell out, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Ten Commandments. And he says, all right. He says, how do they disseminate that information? And we said, Jewish schools. And then he asked, how do they practice their governing laws and values? And we said, they live in community. They support each other. And he's like, great. He's like, now let's take Americans. What is the formative narrative for Americans? And we yell out, independence from Britain. He's like, good. What is the celebration of that formative narrative? Independence Day, 4th of July. Then he says, what are the governing laws and values for Americans? And we yell out, Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And he says, how do we disseminate information concerning our governing laws and values? Like public school systems. And then he says, how do we practice our governing laws and values? And the conversation got a little wonky at that point. So we were saying things like, we elect servant leaders to represent us, and started talking about sort of the structure of the government. But we all chuckled at how, none of our responses to that question were as forceful as the previous assessments. And then he said, okay, now let's discuss African Americans. And he asked, what is the formative narrative for African Americans? And we all got quiet. One person said, is it the civil rights movement? Another person said it's the transatlantic slave trade. And a third person said, well, it's our West African ancestral roots. But no one could say for sure, and so we sat quietly. And then Dr. Lee said, if you don't know your formative narrative, you will adopt someone else's story where the heroes look like them and the villains look like you. Oh, I was gut punched at that moment because, see, it never occurred to me to question whether or not we were going to discuss the improprieties of white theologians before discussing their ethics. And up until that moment, it was odd how I never stopped to wonder, how is it that my government was able to get so close to Dr. King, to record his improprieties and to make them a part of a public record, and still couldn't protect his life? My face was cracked. I was laid bare. But my life was also fixed, because now I had a key, a clue about what had been missing this entire time. It was the absence of a formative narrative. But I was also extremely hopeful, because there are scholars like Dr. Wade Nobles, the foremost scholar on the psyche of people of African descent, who was doing a lot of work to create that formative narrative. And Dr. Ralph Batsui Watkins, my former professor in Atlanta, who is also doing some really pivotal work concerning the formative narrative of African Americans, and he's actually recruiting young scholars to help be a part of that work. But today, when you ask what is the formative narrative of African Americans, the answer with the most integrity is I don't know. But our community is filled with stories of resilience. There's a gospel song that Aretha Franklin sang, how I got over. My soul looks back and wonders how I got over. Yeah, co-sign Aretha. A lot of folks look at our lives and they read our stories in the history annals of this country, and they wonder, how on earth have this people, with everything that they have suffered, been able to survive and dare thrive, a lot of them? Well, I believe the answer to that question is found in the stories that you are about to hear. Stories of resilience, stories of hope as a part of the universal, the hope chest for all of humanity. Stories of the universal experience of resilience, particularized within the African American context. African Americans sharing stories about a time that they fell down, they didn't stay down, they bounced back. Presenting hashtag the Bounce Back RDU. Enjoy.